All right, it looks like we are now live on the AMA for July 2018, and I'll be taking questions in just a moment. I'm just finishing up doing a little work with getting things linked to here and there. So while everybody is rolling in and starting to write their questions and answer, well, questions, at least not questions and answers, I'm going to quick give a thanks to all of my Patreon supporters for making these AMA sessions possible. Take a good bit of time out of the day. I'll try to answer all the questions that I get. Let me give a quick thanks to all of my Patreon supporters. And it's kind of nice here today here in Milwaukee. Anybody who wants the link, wants to become a Patreon supporter, get cool perks and stuff like that, you can easily do so. Yeah, so right now it's kind of overcast and it was hot this week. Got into the 90s and I think in some places up to 100. That's 100 Fahrenheit, of course, not Celsius for any of my non-American listeners and viewers. So here's some questions already shooting in here. Little Yell 69, starting with a big question: what made me study philosophy? And it's not a question that you can answer sort of all at once, because there wasn't any like one moment or thing that made me get into studying philosophy. And then studying philosophy has taken on different meanings over time for me as I have sort of, changed and deepened my approach. I think, at the beginning it was mostly being interested in asking bigger questions and thinking about things in larger scope, and then being told that, hey, that's what they do over in philosophy. And I've mentioned this story many times. I had a philosophy class when I was in high school that was actually quite terrible. And then I had a religion class. It was actually a philosophy class that was actually quite excellent. And then I, went in the army, read some philosophy while I was in there, bought a few books, came out, worked in a restaurant for a while, and then started going back to college and declared a major right away. So Mark Seymour, what do you think of the Barrel? So the Barrel, for those who don't know, is a Facebook group that I was invited to, and they engage in a lot of memes and shit posting. And that's basically what they're doing. It's interesting, but mostly people far younger than I am. And some of the posts are, very interesting and have cool comment threads on them. Some of them, when I look at them and I see that a post is basically just kind of a waste of time, then I don't pay attention to it. Much as, the same thing in the Stoicism forums that I often contribute to as well. But it's cool that we have all these online communities. I mean, think back to what it was like when I was a young man, and we did have some internet connectivity, but it was all dial-up modems and BBSs, and now we have so much interconnectivity with everybody else all over the world. It's very, very cool. Nabil, in Islamic philosophy, Al-Ghazali announced the death of philosophy. Is there anyone in Western philosophy like that? Yeah, there's tons of people. I mean, even just in the last century, in both analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, we had the end of metaphysics, and there's even a great article called The End of Metaphysics, which is about Jean-Luc Marion. Of course, many movements in analytic philosophy have announced, the end of philosophy as we know it. So there's plenty of people doing that, and I imagine there's going to be lots of people doing that for centuries to come. But it's interesting. Philosophy never does die out the way that they seem to demand that it does. All right, Bakajo-san, what are my favorite works of fiction? Well, if I was really, really pressed and I had to say what is my favorite work of fiction, I'm guessing it would probably be something by Philip K. Dick. Um, Man in the High Castle is a pretty brilliant novel, and there's some others that kind of rival too, like Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. I waver. I go back and forth from time to time on that. I also am a huge fan of Dostoevsky, and my favorite work by him is not The Brothers Karamazov, the way everybody feels obligated to say, No, it's the one that's called The Possessed or The Demons, which is another great work. What else has really, really like drawn me in? Um, I think that's probably it for right now. But I went through like a Graham Greene phase and an Iris Murdoch phase, and there's quite a few works of fiction that I really enjoy, and some of them are classic things. I do enjoy rereading the Odyssey. I had to teach it recently to a tutorial client, and it was fun to go back over it. All right. Oh, here's an interesting one. Yunatan, any quick advice to give to someone who is about to give their first lecture? Yeah. So, without becoming obsessive about it, pay attention to how you're speaking to the audience, because there's a tendency for first-time lecturers or readers to read and speak very fast, and also in a way that's a bit monotonic. And remember that you may be reading something that's available as a paper, like at a conference, or maybe you're just giving a public lecture. The audience can only follow you if you leave some pauses and if you don't speak at them too fast. I know there's a tendency, especially if you really love your topic, to want to talk pretty fast, but because you get as much stuff in there as you can. But people can only process so much. So every once in a while, maybe take a pause, and that will help you out. And again, you don't want to be obsessive about it. You don't want that to turn into the one thing that you're thinking about all the time. But that's probably one of the things that I've seen happen the most. The other bit of advice I'll give is, if you screw up, just don't let it get to you, and start from where you screwed up, and the audience will generally be a-okay with you going back over it. It's not a musical performance. You're working in the world of thought, so and they're there to hear what you have to say. Cyrix, what's your legacy? What would you like to be remembered as? That's a good question. So my legacy is kind of all over the map. It's really only a legacy after you die, so hopefully it won't be a legacy for a long time, right? Or after you retire. I don't plan to ever retire. I'll probably die doing what it is that I do. What is it? Well, I suppose that the YouTube videos are probably a big part of it. I've done quite a bit of academic writing, but nowhere near what I imagined I would have gotten done by this time. So I don't know that that's really that big of a legacy. Certainly not what I was shooting for. And there's all sorts of other things. I've helped a lot of people by making connections or introductions or giving people advice. And I've had enough time. It already started happening when I was a young professor, but I had enough time seeing the fruits of that to think that there's every one of us can have a kind of hidden legacy of people we've influenced and helped out, that we may not even know about, or are never going to actually be on anybody else's radar. And I think that's more important in some respects. What would I like to leave as my legacy? I'd like to do a lot more writing and have that stuff out there. I keep on, I plan on shooting the videos. I'm just gesturing at the chalkboard behind me. I plan on shooting videos until, videos quit being a medium, or I get too old and sick to do that, or, if people just say, hey, you need to hang it up, you're getting senile, or thing like that. I'm going to try to turn a light on here. See, it's really quite dark. So let me, there we go. That's a bit better. One of my studio lights. Francis, a longtime commentator on the videos and participant in these. My old mentor's brother had their father tell them to go to university, even when the brother was a successful entrepreneur. What is the true intellectual personal value of education? I guess that really depends on, what you're studying and who you're studying it with and what attitude you're bringing to it. And, where you are sort of in your life and progression. There is something to be said for studying for the sake of studying, learning for the sake of learning, rather than without any attempt to read any instrumental value. In the humanities are the classics because people have found them valuable, both for applying things and understanding, the situations that we're in, but also for their own sake, generation after generation after generation. I mean, there's also the we created a canon, so we have to stick to it, but that's not really enough to keep that going. So I think that's part of it as well. Diamond Pereva. Hi, Dr. Sadler. You're a legend. I was wondering whether you believe in God or not, and why. Well, this is something I've talked about quite a bit here and there. I believe in God, and I grew up Catholic, left the church, came back. I'm now kind of a fairly, when it comes to practice, lukewarm and not very consistent person, but I don't have any issues with belief. And it's one of those sorts of things where I think in part because I've read so much within the ancients and the medievals and the early moderns, and seeing other people take interesting thoughts seriously helps with that. I mean, the real question that I think one ought to ask is not, do you believe in God? Because hell, that could mean anything, It can be some guy who thinks of God as like the bearded guy in the sky who shoots lightning bolts when you're naughty or something like that, or it could be some deist watchmaker's God, or could be all sorts of things. The real question that people want to consider is, well, how do they conceive of God, and how do they think they get at any sort of understanding of the divine? Let's look at some more here. It just kind of jumped a bit because I think a lot of people have written stuff. Philosophy and science. What do you think of communism and Slavoj Zizek? Well, communism is an equivocal term. It means a lot of different things. You might have in mind actual communist states of the present, like say North Korea, or the thing that is kind of communist and kind of not. The People's Republic of China, which I think is actually much more similar to its old imperial states at this point. When you have a party Congress where the party actually decides that workers are not that important, debatable how communist you really are. And then there's, communism understood as a philosophy, and there's a lot of varieties of that. It's not just whipping out Marx. There's been a lot of different going off. I think that Marx was right about quite a few things, but I don't take any one philosopher as the prophet who's got everything right. Zizek, he's an interesting guy. He demands a lot of time and effort to really get at everything that he's doing in his works, and quite frankly, I don't have that time available to me. So I read, I've read his stuff in the past. I don't spend much time on it now, but I do enjoy when he comes out with op-ed pieces, and I know where he's coming from on that. Rayan Marufi, how can I learn about modal logic? Is there a good introductory book? I don't know if there's a good introductory book. There's all sorts of introductory books for modal logic out there. that you can check out. And I would just, go to the library and dig around. All the presentations of modal logic that I'm aware of do so in a very straightforward, axiomatic way. You do, of course, need to know the basics of the predicate calculus in order to be able to understand modal logic. But it's fairly straightforward stuff, I think. Daruma, what do you think of Jordan Peterson? Asked and answered many, many times already, so I'm not going to go over that again. Juan Rodriguez, which of Immanuel Kant's books would be the best to start with? Now, that's a great question. Yeah, Kant is somebody who, like Aristotle, there's no easy introductory book to get into, right? I mean, with like Epictetus, you can say, okay, read the Enchiridion. With Plato, well, maybe we'll have you read the Meno or the Ion or the Apology, So Kant does have two books that are more or less like introductions to the speculative or theoretical philosophy, the range of pure reason, and the practical philosophy, the realm of practical reason. And those are the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, and the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals. And these are the books that I think most generally we introduce Kant to learners through. The other thing you could read, Hackett actually has a nice little edition with like essays like Perpetual Peace and What is Enlightenment and stuff like that in it. And those are a good introduction to Kant too, but you're not going to get so much of his philosophy through that. The biggest problem with Kant, I think, is it's almost like the stuff that he's writing is put into a sort of code that needs to be explained to you. You read terms and you're like, well, what's this analytic synthetic thing that he's talking about? Or he'll use a word like experience or desire, and he doesn't always mean the same thing that you mean by it in ordinary life. So it's very important to sort of learn how to crack that code. And once you do, then a lot of it falls into place, and then some of it you're like, he can't possibly mean that, can he? And the answer is yes, he does mean that. Like when Kant thinks that happiness has really nothing to do with ethics, or at least your happiness, he is serious about that. So yeah, I mean, generally the groundwork or the prolegomena. And I will mention that when I have the time, which will probably not be until next year, I do want to shoot a series of core concept videos on the prolegomena. I've got plenty on the groundwork of metaphysics and morals. And I will be bringing out online classes on both of them in my Teachable Academy. So you can look for those. All right, Muhammad. Nietzsche talked about the higher man in his fourth book, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Who is he? I don't mean the Übermensch. I don't know. I'd have to go back to that. I'm kind of hazy about that reference. There's, we don't just have one single like Superman or great man or somebody who can free themselves from the shackles of culture and nihilism and all that. There's a variety of types within Nietzsche. So 2046, thanks for your videos and lectures. I enjoyed your series on Plato and Aristotle. You talk a lot about the virtues and happiness. What is Aristotle's meta-ethics? What is the grounding of the virtues? Meta-ethics, I'm going to say this sort of like once and for all, is pretty much bullshit. That's a distinction that analytic philosophers love to make, and it doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. When you actually think things through, every substantive ethics has a meta-ethics. It has a view on what ethics is about and how moral judgments arise and criticisms of its other rival theories. And likewise, every meta-ethics is a substantive ethics. Emotivism is a great example. So if you're trying to approach things in a very axiomatic sort of like, well, here's the meta-ethics and then here's the substantive ethics, a very artificial way, you're not going to understand Aristotle. What is the grounding of the virtues? He gives you a bunch of different discussions of that. Some of it has to do with the function of human beings. Some of it has to do with our orientation towards happiness. Some of it has to do with the very nature of what a virtue is. But that's there in Nicomachean ethics. So I think you can easily find that. Here's a good question that is not about philosophy at all. And I would have to think about this one. What is my favorite food? If you asked me when I was a kid, you would have had an immediate answer: spaghetti with meatballs. And I still really do love spaghetti with meatballs, and I make my own, sauce and meatballs. I don't make spaghetti, although my wife has a pasta maker, and she wants to start making her own pasta. I mean, another thing that I really do like is a good hot sour soup. I got kind of spoiled. I'll tell you a little bit of a digression story. So when I was an undergraduate, I got hired as a tutor to tutor these two Chinese students from Taiwan in American history. And then fairly quickly, there's like a little, circle of Chinese students. One guy from mainland China, a lot of Taiwanese, and a few people from Hong Kong. And they found out that I could tutor very well, and I was good at helping them sort of edit papers to remove the kind of grammar issues and syntax issues that come up when Chinese students are writing in English. And so pretty soon I was tutoring like all sorts of people in this small Chinese community, and the school was only paying me for like 10 to 20 hours a week. So they would help me out by making me food, and also giving me cigarettes, because I smoked at the time. So, and we'd smoke a lot as we were doing these study sessions. So the first time I actually encountered hot sour soup, it was not at a Chinese restaurant. It was, like cooked on the stove at home, and man, it was good. And there's good hot sour soup, and then there's like kind of just phoning it in hot sour soup, and there's different variations. It can be made in different ways. I like it kind of peppery, with the dog ear mushrooms. I don't like people subbing in other mushrooms. But that's another real comfort food for me. All right. Rocco, I would like to hear my take on focus and how to cultivate it. What was my approach to studying when I was getting my degree? Well, that I don't have much to offer, back then I had very good focus. I have somewhat less of it now, in part because I have too many things going on. But a lot of it is a matter of like, when you find your mind wandering from the task, you bring it back. It's a lot. It's sort of using the will to condition the will. And so I don't have a hell of a lot to offer on that. Awful philosophy. I'm looking into phenomenology and have become obsessed with how to do a phenomenological description. Do you have any resources or texts you'd recommend as a how-to write? Thanks. James Eady has an introduction to phenomenology book that, again, I haven't looked at it for a long, long time, but I remember as being quite good, and a lot of people found it useful for learning how to write phenomenological descriptions. And I think it's also important to look at the descriptions that classical phenomenologists provided. Maybe not Husserl's, because those are really boring for the most part, but other people's descriptions, like Merleau-Ponty is kind of fun to read, or Levinas, and use them as kind of models. I think if I remember right, there is like some sort of repository out there on the internet of phenomenological descriptions, and I don't remember which group it was associated with, but I think there's some stuff out there. Pedro, what do I think of Nietzschean thought and strictness of thinking and morality? Well, Nietzsche is one of those thinkers. There's like about 30 different Nietzsches out there, depending on who's interpreting them, right? So Nietzschean thought, I like Nietzsche as a thinker. I think he's very interesting. I think sometimes he's on point in his criticisms of other people, and sometimes he's way off track. But I like, working through him. He's always fun. Strictness of thinking and morality. I think there are ways in which, we can get into cul-de-sacs, so to speak, with being very rigorous or thinking we're rigorous in the ways that we're applying our thought and morality. And sometimes they really are rooted into, more less rational and more emotionally based things, or just part of our culture, right? So Nietzsche can be useful that way. I'm not sure about Negro Cornelio's question. What did you treat at your PhD? So I can't really say. Nancy Mohas, are you going to have more classes about Hannah Arendt? I don't have any classes about Hannah Arendt. I did a lecture about her. That's not a class. Will I have more lectures about Arendt? Yeah. Will I ever have classes about Arendt? I may. It depends on how much I can get done. So, my answer very often to anybody who's asking about, do you want to see this or you want to see that? Are you supporting on Patreon? Because that, I don't, I do teach occasionally as an adjunct. That's not providing my main income. My main income is provided by the services that I do in terms of tutoring, speaking, all of that sort of stuff. Patreon is there to help me actually get other stuff done on the side. So if you want to see me doing more of the free stuff, that's how to get me to do it, right? Everybody has to earn a living. Salvatore, I remember you having watched some anime with your son. Do you remember any of the titles by any chance? Yeah, we watched Dragon Ball Z, and I don't remember any other stuff, but he's really big on that, and that's great. But he doesn't like when I ask a lot of questions about the people or what the hell's going on. So, and I understand, because I didn't like that when I was a kid and people had asked me about, these pictures on the D&D books or things like that. Or, the heavy metal bands that I was listening to. But yeah, I mean, anime is not something I'm going to put a lot of time or thought into, quite frankly. TK, what do you think makes a good person, and which philosophical works do you feel represent those values best? So, I'm a virtue ethicist. I think that the traditional virtues are important. Those include, key ones that we often call cardinal virtues, like justice, courage or fortitude, temperance. I think Aristotle was on the right track in talking about, the virtues concerned with honor and wealth is something different. I think that anger probably should be treated as its own separate thing, the way Aristotle did, rather than sort of pushed into temperance or pushed into courage or anything like that. And I think that, honesty is a very important one in our own time. There's a lot of people who are honest in one sense, but also complete jerks in another sense. It's, if you want to say, I'm just being honest with people, you really have to you have a duty to think through whether you've got it right, the terrible thing that you're telling them about stuff. And I think that's part of what goes into it. I also think that, this is something that doesn't get emphasized enough with virtue ethics until recently. We need to think about the fabric of our relationships with others and how they function as a sounding board or check-in point for us. We need friends who can say, hey man, you're screwing up. You're acting like a dick. You need to fix this. That sort of thing. I think everybody needs that. Even the proverbial sage. Why are they sages? Because they surround themselves with the right people to help them do that sort of thing. So which philosophical works represent those values best? Well, you can't really go wrong with starting with, I've mentioned this in a number of places, Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Epictetus's Discourses. Those are three great works. They don't encompass everything you need, but they set a good agenda for you that you can then fill in with other things. Boss asks a sort of impossible to answer question. Did Hegel agree with Kant's critique of pure reason? What you mean, like with the whole book? Or with some sort of outline of it? Or with what Kant's project was? Or, I mean, and what do we mean by agree here? Hegel obviously is doing something different and is not just merely teaching Kant. So, yeah, there's going to be some places where he's disagreeing with Kant. I think he viewed Kant's work as an important advance, but rather formal and is sort of raising problems that it didn't resolve. But what does it mean to agree with an entire work? I don't know. Does that mean agreeing with every single proposition in it, or agreeing with where it winds up, or that's something to think about. Mohammed, is there any philosophy on artificial intelligence? Yeah, there's plenty of it. And the whole idea of artificial intelligence doesn't just come out of comp sci people. It comes out of philosophers reflecting on it, and much of what those guys are doing at high levels, just as with any field, became philosophy. I mean, think about Alan Turing and the Turing test. Is the Turing test merely something in comp sci, or is it a bit of philosophy there? So yeah, there's tons of stuff. Mike Ray, what are your agreements and disagreements with Marx? Well, I mean, that would be quite a long thing. I think that, to begin with, the whole historical determinism thing, I think, is wrong. Right? And I think that Marx, and this is a critique, many other people make as well. I mean, think about Max Scheler and his arguments with Marx. I think that Marx is good in picking out how economic developments and dynamics drive things within other areas and are often overlooked. But he's wrong to try to reduce everything to the economic sphere, and so are traditional Marxists in that respect. I also think that one of my favorite works by Marx is actually the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon. 18th Brumaire of, now I'm going to have to look it up. I'm getting it mixed up. And it's about how, if you read that work, it's the one where he says, like, there's the whole tragedy farce thing, but it's really about how social breakdown occurs and how elements of what we might call a sort of proto-fascist regime can come in and take advantage of class distinctions and the parties that go along with that, and exploit it and eventually install a military dictatorship. Quite a good work, well worth thinking about. All right. Correct answers. What is the difference between reason and intellect, if there is any? Depends on whose version of reason and intellect you're working with. That is a distinction that does get made in the Middle Ages. For example, between they call it ratio and intellectus. Some thinkers like Anselm, and you won't find this in the treatises, you'll find this in the memorials of St. Anselm, because this is either the Dicti Anselmi or the De Similitudinibus, says they're the same thing, right? Somebody else like Thomas Aquinas or many other people in there, or think about Boethius before that, right, will differentiate, and intellectus is higher than ratio. So understanding or intellect is higher than reason. Reason is discursive, intellect is non-discursive. In German idealism, it's the opposite. In that case, for Kant, Verstand, understanding, intellect, is lower, and Vernunft, reason, is higher. And you see that again in Hegel, and you see that in the English followers of transcendental philosophy, like Coleridge. So it really depends on whose scheme you're adopting, right? And each one has got different ways of articulating it. So you've got to look at what they have to say. Wilhelm, what are the problems in Husserl's conception of the transcendental ego? I have no idea at this point, because I don't really spend much time on Husserl or critique about him, so I don't know what I would say about that at this point. All right, I just lost things because it scrolled down a bit. Oh, Sirex, what is the ideal world, philosophical or not, in your opinion? Meaning not what is possible, but what would be ideal if it could be, then why could it not be? Well, it would be a world in which everybody's needs are met, everybody's able to develop and is respected, and their humanity can fully flourish. Why could it not be? I mean, look around. Are there prospects for that? For most people, not so much. We're in kind of a mess, but we're not in much more of a mess than we have been in the past, you know. Osun, why did you choose philosophy? Are you happy with your choice? There's no one single thing that made me choose philosophy. Am I happy with my choice? Yeah, but I understand philosophy in a broad enough way that it ties in with history and literature, and it has something to do with my life. If I was a typical, very narrowly specialized academic philosopher, maybe not so much. Dr. Nancy Mohas, is your God believe close to Spinoza's or different? It's nothing like Spinoza's. You know? I mean, very few people are like Spinoza when it comes down to it. You know, there's this great line about Hegel, right? That if Hegel was a Christian, he was in a church of one. Meaning he was the only guy who saw things exactly the way that he did. And there's more people who see things Spinoza's way, but not a hell of a lot of them. So, Rancid Logic Philosophy Channel, ever going to do a video on Jean Meslier, the medieval French Catholic priest who was really an atheist? Probably not. I mean, unless you commission me to do it, because I've got a lot of other stuff that needs to be done. You know, there's so many gaps in the videos that I've got available. I mean, think about it this way. I just brought up Spinoza. I'd do Spinoza way before I would work on some figure like that, unless again somebody commissions me. If you really want to see a video on X, then you can hire me to create those videos. It's sort of like the thing about the hobby horse. You can ride your hobby horse all you like on the King's Highway, but you got to pay the tolls. So, how should one read? Specifically, how do you read? Do you take notes as you read, or after, both? And how do you retain all this learned information? Well, I'm not a good model because I have never been somebody who had a lot of trouble retaining information, and I'm kind of slipshod in note taking. Oftentimes when I write notes, I don't go back to them. When I was like prepping for my preliminary examinations, I did a lot more note taking. But in general, I read what I'm reading, and if I decide I want to take notes, I'll usually write it in the book, or if I'm, using a Kindle or a PDF, I just use a highlight function. But my way is not a way that's going to work for most people, I think. Osun, who's your favorite philosopher? I do not have a favorite philosopher. I have a number of favorite philosophers, and they kind of fit into a pantheon, you could say. Marilyn Cronenberg, where can I find the best explanation of the Gadamer-Habermas debate? No idea. That's something that I imagine you would want to write to Gadamer or Habermas scholars, and maybe they could give you an answer. On Enlightenment philosophers like Hume, Locke, Berkeley, and Pascal. Well, if you've been following me on Patreon or in YouTube or things like that, you know that I actually am shooting videos on Pascal. And those should be coming out fairly soon, now that I've got those Plato videos out of the way. And yeah, I'll be shooting videos on other thinkers. I mean, you've got a lot of empiricists in there, Hume, Locke, and Berkeley. And I'll do that when I can. Again, if you want to see content that you're really into, getting placed up front, you feel free to write me at greg@reason.io, and we'll talk about a commission. Who is this? What are some of the walls you've found in the study of the philosophy of language? Mostly disciplinary stuff, right? Where people don't read each other's work. And they're reinventing wheels, or they're saying this can't be done, even though this person over here already did it. That's probably some of the biggest stuff. Um, why isn't Kant's lectures on ethics a good intro to his thoughts? The essays in it are actually quite fun to read and don't presuppose familiarity with his writings. Well, if that works for you, then that works for you. I've already answered the question, so there's your own thing. Negru Cornelio, what advice do you give for someone who wants to make a PhD in philosophy? Shot a whole video about that. Easily Google comment here. PhD in philosophy, aka waste of time, unemployable garbage. That's just a dumb comment to make. Because obviously some of us are employed. Kind of weird to get on somebody's AMA and then tear down the degree that they have, but that's fine. Daniel, do you think there could be an analytic reading of Hegel? Does the fact that many Hegel's terms, notion, spirit, negation, shift, and develop prevent dialectical reason from being analyzed? There are analytic readings of Hegel. Brandom is a good example of that. Of course, though, when you read Brandom, you realize that he actually starts to become very different than most analytic philosophers, in that he actually knows the field quite well, and he references Hegel's predecessors and stuff like that. You could ask the same question: can there really be an analytic Thomism? An analytic treatment of Thomas Aquinas' works that's really faithful to the movement of his thought. Analytic Nietzsche. I'm very dubious of these, in part because I've seen these projects, and usually they're not very good. But there's people doing it, so that's what they do. Artavan, thanks for the videos. They help a lot. Glad that they do help you. So that's really nice, and that's why I have them out there. It looks like Neil is all over the place, talking smack at different people on here. So I am going to put him in a timeout. All right. Let's see here. Gnog Levy. Can any of the Stoics help me deal with a lack of air conditioning during a heat wave? Yeah, you can pick them up and fan yourself with them, right? That's a silly answer, but yeah, I mean, you can think of it as physical hardship. I mean, I'll tell you a story. When I was in graduate school, I lived for about 4 or 5 of the years in my graduate school existence in a trailer that was older than me, in a trailer park. And the air conditioner worked, but the trailer was so old and rickety, and the windows weren't good. I never turned the air conditioner on. And this was in Southern Illinois, where we would have day after day of 100-degree weather, super humid. And I would just set up one fan at one end of it and another fan at the other end. It was so hot in there that my cats would pant like dogs, and they would go hide in the bathroom. And that's the environment in which I was studying for my preliminary examinations and writing my course papers and reading. And then in the winter, I kept, because, again, it wasn't very well insulated, I kept the trailer at a cool 55 degrees. That's what I set the thermostat at. And I made it. It didn't kill me. It actually probably toughened me up quite a bit. As a matter of fact, the only time I actually had air conditioning and used it was when I lived with other people who couldn't do without it. And when I have the opportunity not to have the air on and just be in the natural environment, I usually do that. So yeah, that's a good question for you. I mean, you could think of it in terms of voluntary endurance of hardship and trying to use it to make yourself stronger. All right, let's look down. Subconscious qualms. Are there any fascist philosophers whose works are worth reading? It depends on what you want to read them for. I mean, and this also applies to sort of proto-fascists like Charles Maurras. If you want to understand what fascism was about and what people were thinking at the time and how it could become attractive, then yeah, you want to read them. Or if you see them as a present danger, yeah, you probably should read them. Are there any who are worth reading in the same sense that like reading Cicero is worth it or reading Aristotle is worth it? Nobody comes to mind for me. But you know, that's that's me. All right, here's one totally out of philosophy. Boogie Reverie, 5 all-time favorite records in no particular order. And it's a good question. So they're all going to be metal for me, of course. Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind, Judas Priest, Sin After Sin, Motorhead's Another Perfect Day, Tank's Honor and Blood, and Rats Out of the Cellar. Jeremiah Sir, can Viktor Frankl be considered a philosopher? Good question. Yeah, he definitely can be considered a philosopher. And I mean, you know, he's also at the same time a psychotherapist, also a psychologist. But those, you know, we often like to. There's a broader point. We often like to say a person's like this or they're that. They're either a philosopher or they make sense out of this because of the grammar. So I'm going to skip that one. Garrett, what does Kierkegaard mean by dialectical? The more I read, the more I feel like there's different meanings of dialectical he uses. That's a good point. I think that's right. I think that dialectical does have different senses. So I'll say a few things, right? So in the immediate background, of course, is Hegel, and not just Hegel, but there's also another sense of dialectical that Kierkegaard is incredibly aware of, because Kierkegaard isn't just a guy who's responding to the philosophy of his time. He is somebody who knows Plato and Aristotle and a lot of classic philosophy inside and out. He wrote his dissertation on Socrates. So Socrates put forth, an understanding of dialectic that Plato picks up on, and that's something lurking in the background. Aristotle also spends a good bit of time, particularly in the Topics, and a little bit in some other works like the Metaphysics and the Rhetoric, talking about dialectic and what it does as well. So those are all kind of lurking in the background. And I think you're right that he's probably got more than one sense going on. Ricardo Flores, what are your thoughts on Trump? Well, I didn't vote for him. I think he's an embarrassment. I think that the Republican Party is really digging itself into a hole by going in all in on supporting him and on supporting other sort of things in their own orbit. And yeah, I mean, the stuff that he routinely says and the fact that he thinks that it's okay to say it is pretty awful. Things have gotten really bad, and bad on a lot of different sides. If I want to imitate him, right, many sides. There's a lot of blame to be thrown around that we have this guy in charge, and his like ever shifting cast of yes men characters in the background as well. I don't have any proposals for who ought to replace him, but yeah, he's definitely a sign of the times. The body politic is very sick here in the United States. Robert Hoyson, if you have time, would you say qualifying some hypotheses as impossible, even after having strong current empirical data against them, might be something irrational? Take the notion of future time travel, for example. Humans have the tendency to consider present information and proven hypotheses as absolute. This has been proven to be wrong. I don't really understand the question very well, or the example, how it fits in there. Qualifying some hypotheses as impossible. That's not qualifying. That's sort of categorically saying something, right? Qualifying is when you say, well, if this, then that'll happen. I mean, could deciding that some hypotheses are impossible be something irrational? Yeah, I mean, sure, that's always been the case. So, even if like you could qualify it or say something to be something and have good reasons to do that, or you could just do it because you feel that way, or that's what your current cultural system says, or something like that. So, 2046. Do you think virtue ethics leads to a sort of virtue politics where some degree of statecraft or soulcraft is at work, or that the correct polis should in some degree concern itself with virtue? Ideally, yeah. I mean, it didn't even back in Aristotle's time. Aristotle, if you read his Politics, says, and he's a guy who actually did with his in effect graduate students surveys, empirical studies of all the available Greek polis up until that time. He says none of them are well ruled. None of them have a good constitution. Some have worse, some have better. And so, yeah, it can lead to a sort of virtue politics. That's why when people ask me, well, are you Democrat or Republican? I'm not either. I'm an independent. Oh, so you're a centrist? Nope. I'm too traditional to be a conservative. What passes as a conservative these days, because there's certain values that I think we need to recognize that have dropped out of the picture for the people who should be conserving them. And I'm far too radical to be a liberal, because they eventually converge, but they don't converge just in sort of a base horseshoe theory. If you're concerned with virtue, then you're going to be very unhappy with many of the political processes of the time. And you're going to try to make them better when you can, but also realize that you're dealing with, for the most part, people who are not motivated by that as their value. So, all right. Let me scroll down a bit. I can't read the Chinese characters, so I'm not even going to try to. Is there any philosophy that can help me deal with knowledge that one day the earth, everything on it will be destroyed by the sun, leaving no trace that it ever existed? I'm asking seriously. That's a good question. Yeah. The inevitable, let's make it even bigger. Right now, the current cosmology, the universe will eventually be destroyed in some way, right? Entropy will increase, and we'll have what's called heat death. There's plenty of philosophies that can help you with that. Think about Stoicism. They were materialists. Did they think that, well, okay, so my matter is going to break down eventually, or the cosmos is going to break down? Fuck it. Let's not care about anything. No, they thought that there were values that we could live out here. We could endorse, we could decide for in ways that sometimes sound kind of existentialist, So you can read them and you'll see them talking about these sorts of things. The existentialists, another great example. Even the ones who are seemingly very gloomy, say we can produce our own value here that we can recognize within the world, which is not necessarily an absurd world, by the way. That's Camus or that's Sartre. Simone de Beauvoir calls this an ambiguous world. Gabriel Marcel says it's a mysterious world. Not every existentialist says it's a world without meaning. And there's, if you're adopting some sort of theistic perspective from classical theism, the universe isn't all, the current, universe isn't all that we've got to work with. So you could endorse something like that as well. Negro Cornelio, can you tell us the best joke you know about a philosopher or philosophy? I don't know if it's the best joke, but here's a good one. Why are the disputes in philosophy departments so incredibly bitter? Because the stakes are so low. So I've been telling that joke for 20 years since I've heard it, and I still think it's very funny, but it's the kind of laughter that comes with, sort of a recognition of how bad the situation is. Edmundo, how important is foreign language study for philosophical studies? Very important. If you want to be able to read your books in different languages, in the original, you got to study the language. And you can't just study it enough to be able to read a newspaper. You have to learn, you got to learn that whole sort of linguistic system to some degree. And sometimes it may be of a different time. I mean, there's people who are like, oh yeah, I'm going to read Plato, so I'm going to take some Greek classes. Well, that's demonic Greek. That's like, a very different Greek than Plato's time. Or I'll take some biblical Greek. Well, that's Koine. It's not the same thing as Attic Greek. So it depends. Yeah, if you want to be able to read stuff in the original, and if you want to be exposed to a much wider range of scholarship, then it's good to read foreign languages. Like, so I do work on St. Anselm, for example, or Thomas Hobbes, or Alistair McIntyre, right? It may be that there's some stuff out there that I want to read that's in German or French, or even languages that I can't really read, but I can kind of puzzle through in a way, like say Portuguese or Italian. Because academic stuff is there's a lot of cognates, and if you know the grammar a little bit, you can kind of puzzle things out. Man, it's often really cool to like find there was a French guy who was talking about this very problem that I'm talking about, and nobody in the English literature has caught on to it, but this French guy did, and being able to read it, so it's pretty important. Kelly's Andrina Rodriguez. What do I think about romantic love? It seems to be an emotion that veils rationality. Should we fight it to live a better life? Could you recommend some books to reflect deeper about it? Thanks. I think that romantic love can sometimes be very irrational, especially when we elevate it, as we do often in our own culture and has been done in Western culture quite often, to this very high value that trumps other values. But can romantic love be integrated with rationality? I think so. And we have plenty of examples of people who are able to do that. So, should we fight romantic love to live a better life? It depends on what that romantic love is like. If we're just talking about some sort of blind, irrational desire, like what comes with infatuation, we're like, oh, I can't stop talking about this person, oh, it's so incredible. Yeah, that's probably going to screw you up. But a deep, intimate love that comes over time and is expressed through erotic desire and actions and sort of a reciprocity with that. I think that's very important in many people's lives. Not everybody, I mean, this is why, for example, some people might choose to be celibate, and say I'm that's a distraction for me. But yeah. All right, Dylan, I'm going to try to get through as many things as I can very quickly. There's a lot of things here. I'd like to know what you think about Marx's relation to Hegel, perhaps Marx more broadly. Pinker thinks Marx got Hegel wrong. What's your personal opinion? Marx is a left Hegelian. That means that he thinks that Hegel got some stuff wrong and needs to be improved in certain ways. Did Marx fully understand Hegel? Maybe, maybe not. Marx is doing his own thing that's definitely influenced by Hegel. Kelly's again. Could you recommend some philosophers who've written about migration or immigration? Well, Derrida started bringing that up back in the 90s. With the figure of the guest. Somebody else who I think is particularly relevant would be. I'm blanking on his name. He's an Italian philosopher. My wife actually got to study with him. He writes about bare life. Oh, I hate when this happens. Agamben, Giorgio Agamben. Kristeva also has written some things about immigration as well. So that could be quite good. Mike, is the Vola the Dark Souls of philosophy, or would that be Hegel? I don't understand the Dark Souls reference because I'm not a gamer, so couldn't really say. All right. Western Man, have you read Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West? You buy into his theory, cyclical decline of all civilizations and their possession of unique prime symbol. Read it when I was much younger. Never bought into it. It always seemed a little bit, oversimplistic to me. Oh, here's a good question. Cyrix, what would be the best way to deal with guilt that arises from empathetic feelings towards people you see in the world having a horrible time in this life, but you can only do so much to help as much? Turning off this guilt would feel like being selfish, which then brings in more guilt for even thinking about shutting you off sensitivity to other people's sufferings. This is something I have struggled with. So yeah, that is a real conundrum. What you want to do, you might actually like chart it all out, and then think about each of them. You might actually like chart it all thing for anyone. Does it make sense for you to be sort of in this quandary of helplessness and guilt, or is it better that you help one person, and then be all right with that? And that takes a lot to do. All right, we're a little bit close to the end, and I actually do have to end fairly close to time this time. Edmundo, have you heard about the Spanish philosopher Gustavo Bueno? He developed a very interesting system called philosophical materialism. I have not. Sounds like an interesting thing. And somebody asked about Jordan Peterson. I've already answered that. Let's see what else I can come to a nice close on. Western man wants to argue about Trump. I don't even bother arguing with people about Trump anymore. You can think whatever you like. Everybody's free to ride their hobby horse down the King's Highway, right? Andre Timos, do you have any advice for getting into philosophy of language? So we'll close on this one. This is a good question. I've brought this up before. I think that de Saussure, who is a linguist, not a philosopher of language, but a very important linguist, Ferdinand de Saussure, recommends that linguists should make sure that they know and understand other languages, and as many of them as possible. Because if you want to say that you have something, to say, understand, draw upon from some phenomena, you really need to know that phenomena. I mean, anybody who's a philosopher of language or a linguist who only really knows English, I ignore them entirely. They have nothing to tell me. So, you want to study languages for the sake of understanding those languages. And then you can start, generalizing about philosophy of language. The other thing I would say is there's a lot of great philosophy of language in ancient and medieval philosophy. You don't want to ignore any of that sort of stuff. Then, you think about what happens in the modern period and with, German romanticists and their discussions of language. That's important. And then we get, continental and analytic philosophy. And you want to study as broadly across as you can. So like I mentioned, you're not ignoring key figures and reinventing wheels that don't need to be reinvented, or ignoring insights that other people have left out. So, all right, so I'm going to bring this to a close. Thanks for all of the comments and questions. I didn't get to a few of them at the end, but try to get to as much as we can. I've got to take care of some editorial work now before I have a few other obligations to get to. So we do this every month. Again, it's underwritten by my Patreon supporters. So let's say thanks to them as well. And we'll do this again next month. We do our philosophy pop-ups. We'll be doing another philosophy pop-up later this month on Facebook Live. And I think that's pretty much it on my end. All right. Have a great afternoon for those of you here in this hemisphere. Those of you in other places, great morning, great evening, great night.